Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Fundamental Principle. It is my pleasure to have today both my co-host Patrick and a special guest, uh, Mario Goretti, the host of the Daily Decade, one of my personal favorite programs um, that I believe is both a source of great wisdom and of that one great weapon that all of us have in common, the rosary. Um, a source of prayer and of Mario's personal wisdom. I regard Mario as one of the wisest men I know, and I value his counsel and his friendship very highly. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce Mario Goretti to the wider audience. Mario, if you could just tell the audience a little bit about yourself to let them know kind of where you're at and give them an introduction to the Daily Decade and your project.
Sure, sure. I started the decade in 2020 as I was coming out of Orthodoxy into back into Roman Catholicism. Not the Catholicism of my youth, but the Catholicism of my mother's youth, really, because it was my grandmother who was most responsible, my Irish grandmother who was most responsible for planting the seeds of the rosary in my heart and keeping me attached through all of my wanders in the desert back to the religion of my people. And so when things started to really go crazy, I looked at everything that was coming out. I was listening to just about everything that was out there at the time, whether it was the stuff that was throughout the right wing, TDS, all of the various racial and political podcasts that were out there. But I noticed that even in our spheres, no one was doing anything devotional or religious at all. It was all just politics. And politics has this rare ability to take even the most optimistic person and turn them into just plunge them into despair about the world, particularly in what we were going through in 2020 between COVID and the election mess and everything else. And so I saw an opportunity and said, look, somebody's got to do something for this group of people who can see clearly everything that's going on around us. We know what COVID is. We know about the realities of race. We know the realities of Jewish power, all of these things, and we're alone. And the only thing we're getting is just more of the end times, more of the clown world, more of the reminders of how bad things are, but no one is equipping us at all with any of the weaponry that we need to fight the spiritual battle that most of us are neglecting. And since I was in a point of conversion at that time, moving from an institution that I had lost faith in, because the Orthodox churches all bent the knee when COVID hit, into an institution that I had more faith in, which was mostly the Rosary and the Sacred Heart, and therefore by default, Catholicism. I felt that the thing that had saved me was devotion, so that's what I wanted to bring to everybody else. And that was how the Daily Decade was born. Started out as just a thing I did every single day. We did a Decade of the Rosary, and I posted it to Telegram. Then I turned it into a larger podcast, and that ran for a couple of years, and then personal things intervened that had made it impossible for me to continue. And I'm just now trying to reinitiate it as a Telegram phenomenon and hopefully get a proper podcast and Gumroad and a couple of other things going so that we can get it back off the ground again. Because I've had so many people come to me and tell me, why aren't you doing this anymore? Please do this again. When they discovered I was doing it on Telegram, I had people I haven't spoken to for years reach out to me and say, I see you're doing it again. Thank you. So clearly, whatever meager effort I'm putting out there is having an effect. So I'm going to try to boost it up a little bit and bring people more of this thing that clearly we still need.
I've never found it not profitable.
Exactly. It's well, I mean, it's the opening lines of the Memorare, you know.
And it's both for your personal. I mean, again, you're one of the wisest men I know, and I respect.
I squirm every time you say that.
Well, I've under the difficult. I'm in a position where I think we're both, thoroughly middle aged at this point, but I've been doing this long enough. The young men like, oh, I was, like in high school when I listened to you for the first time, now they're thoroughly middle aged with families of their own, and so I share your trepidation at being thought of as a fount of wisdom, but nevertheless, sir, I must commend you. No, it's not just your personal insight that I found valuable, but the timeless rock, the chain of the rosary that chains us to Our Lady and chains us to the truth, that that perpetual reminder is a useful and good thing. And to your point about how difficult the last, say, 6 years have been, um, I think it was Gregory Hood at Over American Renaissance who put it this way, but we live in a media dominated state, and um, for us to be in a position where the media just gaslights people all the time, it just lies all the time. We're recording this the day after Thanksgiving in 2024, and I'm sure many of our listeners had the experience of listening to relatives talk about issues at Thanksgiving and living in a completely different world than those relatives just because you have different sources of media. And essentially, what the problem in the church and the state is bad sources of information. And how do you filter bad sources of information and good sources of information? And of course, St. Vincent of Lerins tells us to, reject all novelty. The scriptures itself say, if someone preaches something new, be, treat them as anathema. But
Hold only to that which all people have held everywhere at all times in the
ex-
with it in the church.
exactly. And our great difficulty at this particular moment is we have no trustworthy authorities that are universally recognized. I personally regard, say, someone like Bishop Williamson as completely trustworthy because he's honest about the most important issues of the day. But for millions and millions of people who are trying to be faithful Catholics, they regard Bishop Williamson as a schismatic, and I can't fault them.
And some of them regard him as a schizophrenic.
Yeah,
You
and
have you have the added problem of the there's still this wall that a lot of that some people need to break through. Even those of us who have the mindset that people would call conspiracy theorists, there are still people who espouse conspiracy theories that we think are bonkers, and therefore we fall back on that mental framework of, well, he's just a conspiracy theorist. He's just it's Williamson falls for anything. There are plenty of people out there who would otherwise be open to him, but they still can't get rid of that mind virus.
yeah, and it's a very difficult when between the documented like Operation Mockingbird stuff, where in all likelihood Bill Buckley was just a CIA plant there to um, guide the conservative movement away from true things like the Birchers or um, uh, racial realism or what have you, right? And fair bit of evidence that he was himself a sodomite, and right. So we have like documented Operation Northwoods, Occupation Mockingbird, or Operation Mockingbird, and we have this media that continually lies about stuff we know is just not true. Um, there's an epistemological crisis between that and deep fakes and artificial intelligence and foreign influence operations, domestic influence operations. There's a real difficulty in finding the truth, and it's only when we're grounded in the spiritual truth of Holy Mother Church and the timeless teachings thereof, not only the novelties that would refer to the murderers of Christ, the children of Satan, as quote our elder brothers. That's clearly malicious nonsense. You can't do a 180-degree turn on the people who hold all the power in the media, all the power in the central banks, and then expect you know things to work out inside the church. It's just crazy. And I find the decade very valuable, not because you're necessarily ranting about um, the realities of race or whatever, or the Bagel occupied government or anything like that, but just that you don't reject those necessarily out of hand and then still cling to the truth of the church. And I've said for many years that um, I'm going to die on the left because they've essentially taken any kind of governor off the engine of angry young white men and given them nothing to like Holy Mother Church to say you can't just do this. You can't totally exert will to power because it might be immoral. And then when those young men find out they've been lied to about all of these issues, they're going to go and my friend Jason Miranchuk talks about the vengeful son. You're going to see a swing to the right that's going to make Genghis Khan look like a piker, I think. And the church's job is to acknowledge the truth of what those men have to say and still temper it with mercy. And I don't see anyone in the church right now, with the possible exception of Bishop Williamson and a few others perhaps, who are trying to at least say, you're right about X, Y, Z, and you're not crazy. You yourself are an example of someone who will acknowledge the reality of the world while still calling for Christian justice and Christian mercy. And I think that is a vitally important issue for us to deal with.
Well, and we live in such a dangerous time in that regard because as Bishop Sheen was one of these that really pushed the idea that the laity will save the church, and unfortunately that has become something of a left-wing talking point coming out of the Second Vatican Council. But right now, the reality on the ground is that it's mostly laymen, mostly fathers, men with skin in the game, who are willing to look at the naked reality of things and say, well, no, this is just so, and I need to govern my life according to that. That's the other thing that I find a lot of the push among the Nietzscheans and the neo-pagans and the Baptists and all of the others that fall into that category on the right wing. So many of these are exactly as you say, young men, and a young man doesn't really have skin in the game yet. He doesn't really have the investment in the future beyond. He may be driven by his future. He may be driven by the future generally, but it's always going to be an abstract. He's never going to hold the future in his hands and rock it to sleep at night and watch it grow up, watch it get on a bicycle, watch it get a learner's permit and the first job. That's something that's foreign to him. And that's something that's essential to a lot of, and it's something that's not only foreign to him, but many of them are never going to have that opportunity because of the way that the current social structure is or the current thrust of society is.
Right, it's been robbed of them, and one of the reasons I do what I do is that I want my children to live in a world where I can have grandchildren without there being some sort of miracle. Right? Like I have to, housing prices have to come down because my, now, early elementary age sons need to be able to afford a home in 20 years when they need to be able to, get married and have children. And only this concern for the future that you talked about is only fathers, right? The patriarchs of families have the skin in the game to require of themselves and of others honesty, because you have to care about the future.
And it's not just honesty, but also sacrifice. And it's one thing to discipline yourself in a gym setting or that sort of thing, but there's a degree of humbling yourself and accepting and picking battles that a father has to do and that a patriarch has to do, that an unattached man, a bachelor, an unattached warrior does not have to do. His sacrifices are driven almost entirely by that which is coming within him, and that's true as much, I think, of young Christian men as it is of the men that lean in the direction of the will to power. But a man who has a clan, who has a tribe, who is truly who is in a situation of a patriarch, rather, whether great or small, is one whose sacrifices are placed upon him, as a yoke is placed upon an oxen, as the cross is placed on the shoulder of Christ. Christ dies by his own will, but the cross is placed on his back by another, and that's the image that we keep before us as Christian fathers.
Yeah, well, I think that it's one of the things that Christian fathers can do that our clergy cannot. And if you talk to any group of faithful remnant, whether it's conservative Novus Ordo or SSPX or Sedevacantists um, or just like trad within this current like a ICSIP or Fraternal Society of St. Peter, right? I think those are the major taxonomies of Catholics at the moment. A faithful, no one trusts the authorities in Rome presently. I think a good chunk of this folks who would consider themselves trad at this particular time would buy like some variant of what Pat Coffin has been saying or what Ed Moss has been saying about that Francis is an anti-pope. And I don't criticize anybody, like whatever your status. I personally think that's probably true, but if you agree, like I'm not going to get in an argument with you about it, I guess, because it's a very difficult situation to parse because there's that lack of authority. But only fathers.
That's the. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But only fathers have this stake in where if you take the baptismal promises you made at your children's baptism of like you are going to keep this like to the best of your ability, you're going to help this child keep the faith. That should frighten you a great deal. It should worry you a great deal that a majority of young people raised in Novus Ordo churches apostatize by the time they're 25. Like that should be a gigantic red flag.
And it forms a primary reason why this is an argument that I find myself getting in with other traditional Catholics over the question of the society. I don't make any secret of the fact that I attend a society chapel. I've said it several times on my own podcast, and the question is always posed why, and the answer is because this is where my children are going to get to heaven from, and it has everything to do with the fact that the environment in which they are, whatever legal squabbles are present, whatever historical fights are going on, whatever the society's stance on this, that, or the other thing are, the specific chapel that I currently attend with my family and bring my children to and bring them up to the altar rail at is the one that is the safest bet for me to accomplish the task that I've been given. And not just in the baptismal promises, but the fathers. St. John Chrysostom is very clear that we are answerable as men for the ultimate fate of our children and our wives, which means that each one of them that does not make it on the right side of the divide at the dread judgment seat, we have to answer for them as much as we have to answer for ourselves. And that is terrifying. And it's something that should motivate. And ultimately that's got to be our ultimate concern as men, is right. The souls that depend on us and the souls that we are also souls that we depend on for our own salvation. And that has to outweigh every other consideration.
Right. And you can't criticize me for doing what terrifying in the old sense of the word, of like it is vast and terrible, the idea that I've seen the pain in older relatives whose children have fallen away. It is something that ought to keep you up at night. The idea that any of your children should fall away from the faith, and that you would be partially or even minimally responsible for that, ought to cause you to lose sleep. And the fact that our shepherds, supposedly our bishops, our priests, seem to not care one whit. The men in Rome, the cardinals, who who are given the red for martyrdom, seem to me to be, frankly, a bunch of cowards, um, and apostates. Is it should doubly concern you, because there's no Bishop Sheen you can point to who can say, okay, well, at least I think too many conservative Catholics got used to John Paul II and Benedict XVI and didn't see the rot. They saw the veneer of a supposedly good Holy Father. It wasn't until I tried it that I realized just how bad those two men were in many respects. But they at least gave the appearance of orthodoxy. The idea that John Paul II himself could be great, but all of his cardinal appointments could be terrible, and all the people working for him could be terrible, and that he would still be a good pope is ridiculous. And that you as a father can just trust these people. So, well, wait a minute. Didn't he appoint McCarrick, and didn't he appoint O'Malley, and didn't he appoint Bergoglio, and didn't he appoint all of these men to episcopal sees that are apostate homosexuals? And as a father, like, you're supposed to just ignore that? It seems to me to stretch credulity.
It does stretch credulity, and at the same time, and I won't be. I have no kind words for Ratzinger or Wojtyła or Montini or Roncalli or any of them. But at the same time, I understand those who need to have someone they can point to. What do we have in a world where we have no heroes, where we have no men that we can admire and look up to, or the ones that we can look up to and admire are those that we're not really. We have to teach our children, admire this man, but just don't talk about him too loudly, because that could get us in a lot of trouble. We're in a situation where I can understand why men are grasping at the veneer, because at least the facade, you can admire John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and you're allowed to. And so you push aside what's behind the facade and you just point to the facade, because then at least you can point to that both for yourself as well as for those in your care, and say, well, this is a man who we can admire. Never mind the details, just don't worry about the nuance, but we have the figure. Men need a figurehead. There's a reason why the sacrifice on the cross is the essence of our faith, but the incarnation itself is also because like calls upon like. We need visible leadership. Christ leaves Peter because we need visible leadership. We need someone that's a basic human need, and it's one that we right now, like so many basic human needs, we don't have access to it in the modern setting.
Leadership being extremely important is, I think, a lot of kind of tie in why I like the Daily Decade is you give excellent meditations at the end of your program, and I think there's not enough of mental prayer. There's not enough let's take a moment, let's take 15 minutes, and really just kind of think about what we're praying over, how it ties into. How the rosary ties into, or the different mysteries of the rosary tie into different feast days. And I think that really lacks with we a lot of vocal prayers. We have a lot of this, a lot of media. But how it's very rare that we take the time to sit down and actually meditate on the gospel, scripture, or a piece of the saints. And that's definitely a piece that you're really bringing to the table that I really haven't seen anywhere else.
And that's the part of that is the drive. How often, even at my own parish, do we walk out? We end up talking about Father's sermon, and there's always the young contingent that is arguing over how hard hitting Father's sermon might have been, how based it is. The sermon shouldn't be based. The sermon shouldn't be hardcore. The sermon should provoke you to an inner conversion. And if it's politically based, or it goes hard on the council, or what have you, is that provoking you to an inner conversion, to make you more like the warriors of Christ that died in outside the city of Jerusalem, or the warriors of Christ that were tortured to death in the Roman dungeons, or the warriors of Christ that took the crucifix and put it in front of cannibalistic savages, or drove the Moors from Spain. All of these things that we would describe as hardcore, or that we describe as desirable, this crusading spirit, both within ourselves and outside of ourselves, are we actually converting our hearts? Are we actually following Christ the way that these great men did and great women did? Or are we just sort of caught up in reflecting on, well, this is confirming to my worldview? And that's what makes that's been one of the drives behind doing the meditations the way that I do them on the Decade, is how much reflection are we doing on ourselves. I had I had an article submitted some time ago about the inner crusade. I forget where I wrote it, or I may have just put it on Telegraph, but about the inner crusade. You know, in Islam, there's an outer jihad and there's an inner jihad, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. We need a greater crusade. We need an interior crusade to crush the spirit of evil that lives within all of us, so that we can perfect ourselves, because we're not going to be able to wage any kind of outer crusade, any kind of change to the fabric of society around us now, if we can't overcome those elements of human weakness and human evil within ourselves first. That's why the rosary is described as a weapon.
And I think it's easy to want an outer leader, an exterior leader, somebody that's base, somebody that says all the right things, when it's like you just said, we need that inner conquest first. And maybe that's why we can't have that base leader. Maybe that's why God hasn't given us to somebody that can lead us ahead, because we're not spending enough time in contemplation of His greater will, or His love for us as people. And that definitely something that your program has brought to my life, and it's deeply life changing. I can't tell you enough that it's just how deeply you and positively you've affected me. So I am really thankful for you being here and talking to us. But yeah, no, I agree. It is, and it's, we can't. I think we're beyond the point of we're relying on leadership, and it is the job of the father of each household to make sure.
Today, November 29th is the birthday of Archbishop Lefebvre, and I talked about a little bit about this on a different program, but his father, was killed by the National Socialists in a camp for spying, or died in a camp. He was put in that camp for spying. But Archbishop Lefebvre was one of 8 children, and he and a brother and 3 of his sisters all became religious, and his 3 other siblings all had large Catholic families. So Archbishop Lefebvre had like at least 10 nieces and nephews, right? And his father was a convinced French monarchist and a martyr to his nation. We can argue all day long about who was right and who was wrong in the mid 20th century struggle against liberalism, but we must never forget that priests and bishops and religious come from families, and so that model that you talk about, Mr. Goretti, of basing our life and being the kind of place where our children can become priests and bishops and nuns, and restore a full Catholic culture where it's normal for priests to have. I mean, Archbishop Lefebvre is, I think, a saint. Someday, in God's good time, I think he'll be both a saint and a doctor. But where our priests do come from families of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or more children, and they have 10, 15, 20, 30 nieces and nephews, and that's the norm again, as it was for most of Christendom. That has to start with our families. And, Our Lady enjoined us to pray the rosary at Fatima. And it's only 15, 20 minutes a day. If you can't spare that, you're, every time I miss and then a decade comes out, I convict myself and then I sit down and just do it. I started habitually carrying my rosary in my pocket, thanks to you. It goes with my keys, so I always have it with me. And that minimal effort, you will be amazed at what God does with our mustard seed of 15 or 20 minutes a day, thinking about his life and intending and trying to emulate his mother in her faithfulness, in her sanctity, in her wonderful, wonderful mirroring of our Lord. He will return it unto you 10 or 100-fold, but we have to do it. And I just when we one of the things about this program that we're trying to say is that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and somehow all constituent truths, whether those truths are about the bagels or about the reality of race or about the reality of women, whatever, they're somehow in God's providence, part of his plan. And I just am always grateful every time you talk about all of these things as part of God's plan. And I think that it's very important that we as fathers and we as men, to use a phrase, be the change we want to see in the world.
And yet we can't
So,
we can't do this. I think the father's leading the keystone. We're in an age of individuality where everybody's opinions matter, and kids are supposed to, or kids are told that they can talk about their gender or this, that, and the other. But it's we need to go back to this time where like the father leads the house, and the house is the keystone of the society. And it's, I think, hopefully we can use this program for men to give more space to fathers, to give more, make things concise, that fathers can learn and learn how to lead their communities and how to lead their families into more of a fundamental Catholic worldview. Sorry for cutting you off.
no, and I'll go even a step further than that. It's not just a matter of making the world safe for fathers, but making it safe for tribes again. The essence of the patriarch and his functionality is to imbue his children, his wife, his grandchildren, nieces and nephews with the sense of belonging to the clan and tribe that build the entirety of the Christian community. That's why when St. Paul writes to Timothy and says that a man who does not take provision for his own, especially those of his own house, and I always found that division very interesting, his own, especially those of his own house, he has lost the faith and is worse than an infidel. Christianity rests entirely on the clan and the tribe, not in convoluted genealogies going backward, but in the forward motion of purpose. If you want a world in which families produce priests again, then once again think of it as the racial imperative to elevate your people. That can mean your family, that can mean the tribe, the nation, to reach the highest point that we can reach here on earth, which is uniting which is men being fully and completely united with Christ in the act of offering sacrifice on the altar. There was a time when every family aspired to produce a priest, because that meant that family had accomplished the one goal that God had put them on earth to accomplish, which was to produce a Christ, at the risk of sounding heretical. I'm not talking about the theosophical notion of the Christos, the worthy one, but actually one that is united to Christ, because a priest was as close as ordinary Catholics could think to get to sainthood. And the real goal is to produce a saint. So you put that goal in front of people, and the more people that aim for that goal, the more people you'll find reaching the other goal. I mean, you think about all these the great parents that have produced great saints. Why is St. Monica a saint? Because of Augustine. Why are St. Therese's parents regarded as saints? Because of St. Therese. And you have this long Saint Helena, Saint Olga, all of these parent saints that exist in the church. Why? Because they made the goal of their parenting to create, to produce a saint. And in many cases, if you're not talking about someone who's a royal, the eighth sacrament, in the case of Louis IX, or in the case of Vladimir, or in the case of Constantine, or what have you, you're talking about someone who's in religious life, like St. Therese or St. Augustine. And that's something that we as fathers have to have ahead of us as well. Where's the saint in my clan? Where's the priest in my clan? The sister, the mother superior in my clan? And how do I bring that into being, either in the next generation that I'm raising, or in the generation that I am handing that generation on to?
Well, and one of the great things in life that the church teaches us is that saint comes in bunches. Last week or 2 weeks ago was the feast of St. Albert the Great on the traditional calendar. And St. Albert is, of course, this towering genius, but he's known primarily for his students, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure. Now, can you even imagine being a fly in the wall in that particular classroom? The wisdom and the love of God that just like flowed throughout the it's a good thing that Socrates taught Plato, and that Plato taught Aristotle, and that Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. We should, of course, seek to become like a Lewis and Zelly Martin, but it also we should be grateful, or Archbishop Lefebvre, whose own sister was the sister mother superior of the Sisters of St. Pius X, and like St. Dominic before him, the Archbishop said, first I need sisters, and then I can build priests. We need the spiritual heavy artillery of the sisters to praying and fasting and doing good works to make this go. It is only this toxic notion of American individualism is both anathema to religious life, but it is also anathema to family life. And I love my fellow Americans. There's a lot that I think that is good in what we've been given. I think that our notion of free speech as a way to get to the truth is a good and laudable thing. But this idea that that we aren't mutually dependent upon one another in the Catholic sense of no saint makes it to heaven on their own. You'll be judged on your own, but you don't make it to heaven on your own. What would Saint Teresa of Avila be without Saint John of the Cross, or vice versa? Where would Saint Bonaventure have been without Saint Thomas? Where would Saint Benedict have been without Scholastica? These where would the apostles have been without each other? And I think that you bring up an excellent point, Mario, of wanting all of our children to be saints, but if you'd ask Saint Therese of Lisieux, like, which of your sisters is the saint, I think she would have pointed out to her mother or her older sisters. And I don't think you get a Saint Therese of Lisieux without her mother and her older sisters, who all had entered the Carmel before her. I think it's very important that we keep this sort of thing in mind.
No, without a doubt, it's a matter of well, again, it comes back to nationhood. If America is, and this is the argument over the American nation, a nation is a group of tribes that manifest the way that a group of persons manifest a family. If there's an American nation, it's because the tribes are manifesting a familial tie. If that's not happening, then there's not an American nation. And that's something that I think a lot of people who speak of nationalism don't really understand where are the building blocks of nationalism, and that's something that I think was essential to a number of the groups that organized in the mid 20th century, that recognized what nationalism was and had to be, and why their particular brand of nationalism actually did gain so much ground when it did, was that they saw it fundamentally. Not everyone speaks of the genetic, not as a genetic, but rather as a familial union. You cannot say my country right or wrong, but my country if you don't have a familial sense of that country. And the fewer and fewer people saying that about America manifests that we have fewer and fewer people that really have any kind of familial relationship with that identity. And it's because the identity is so impermanent and so artificial is the wrong word, but perhaps novel is the word. It's so young it hasn't been able to properly coalesce as much as we've tried to force it. And that's why we need to start with the father, start with the family, and build organically from the ground up. Then we'll get a nation. But in the but for right now, and that's everything that I say on the Decade or that I write about. Everything is multi-generational. Everything you have to, if you want to think with the mind of the church, you think in terms of centuries. You don't think in terms of years and months. And that's hard for people because everybody wants it to happen right now, and there's a feeling of crisis around us. But we can't lose.
And the crisis is certainly real. I mean, we have at a bare minimum, a man who is leading the holy office of the Inquisition, who's an apostate homosexual, who writes books about homosexual kissing. I mean, like you can't even make up how level of parody we're at. And we have an ostensible Pope in Rome who will approve, a pagan Mayan mass where women are taking over priestly functions, but the Mass of the Ages that produced all the saints of the church and has been continuously going since St. Gregory the Great, codified what had previously existed, 1,500 years ago, right? So to ignore the crisis and say everything is fine is to lie. But also,
of course, I don't want to give the impression that that's what I'm suggesting.
No.
You just want to stay on a long enough timeline. That's all.
Right. And I firmly believe, like you do, that this is a 2-3 generation project. And many of our I'm grateful that I get to count you as a friend, and we've been friendly for many years. But this, in all the years that I've known you, a lot of what I've spent my life doing is a multi-generation project of getting people to live in cities that are Catholic again, where at the center of the, Archbishop Sheen talked about this. Charles Borromeo talked about this. At the center of the city should be the church, and at the center of the church should be the Eucharist. And all the boulevards and neighborhoods should be organized around this organic life of faith. And that's going to take at least 2 and 3 generations to fix the way we live now.
It's going to take us establishing. We talk about housing prices. One of the best ways to solve the housing price crisis is to make sure that you have enough land to hand on to your children. So the only property that's exchanging hands is your own. Now that's not possible for everyone. I'm speaking of an ideal, but it's one of the avenues. We need to explore these avenues in order to create a situation where if we cannot overcome, we sidestep. I think there was a very, very famous mid 20th century politician that said that obstacles don't exist to be surrendered to, only to be overcome. And there's a lot of different ways to overcome the obstacles that we face. And sometimes that means finding the weak point in the wall and going through it rather than knocking the whole wall down. And finding and thinking very seriously about where the chinks in the armor are is because what you're talking about. And that's the whole program of the slaughter of the cities. I say frequently that if I do like E. Michael Jones and some of the things that he's written, but he really had one book in him, and that was Slaughter of the Cities, because that's the book that pens down the whole program. That's the book that pens down the shattering of the actual national and tribal identities and realities that existed on this continent, that made for the possibility of a real Catholic reform of culture. And now we've got to go back to square one and try to rebuild back to that point again in order to get where we need to go.
Amen. Yes, exactly right. And one of the ways that we have to do that, and this is where I think your work is so valuable. We have to, as fathers, look at the crisis of an authority of the church and say, where we get our sacraments is, a matter of, unfortunately, individual judgment at this point. But we as fathers must submit. We must chain ourselves to Christ with the rosary. We must chain ourselves to his mother with the rosary, and we must do as we can with what we have. I would argue that we're in a worse situation now than even, the hidden Catholics of Japan were for the 300 years where they went without sacraments, or 250, because they didn't live in an insane society like we do. I mean, they lived in a pagan society, but they lived in a pagan society that at least acknowledged some virtues. We live in one of the most evil societies to ever exist. And I think that your example, while not lying about that, and acknowledging that we do live in a very, very evil society, but of nevertheless doing our duty. The great general and personal hero of mine, Robert E. Lee, said, we should always ask men to do their duty. They can never do more, and they should never do less. As fathers, we can do what Christ has enjoined us, what the church has enjoined us to do, to lead a family in prayer, to be personally holy, and etc. And I just want to thank you for your constant exhortations and help along the way as a fellow father who's in this same difficult position. But we must not surrender our paternal authority to these shadows and penumbras of liturgical authority just because it looks like that. The liturgical and priestly authorities that would tell us to ignore the Pachamama are not legitimate, and it's a difficult task for fathers to decide, to discern where the truth lies. But if you do as you have done and chain yourself to Christ through the rosary, you are in a much better place of being able to discern whether that's true or not.
Without a doubt, and there's two responses that I have to what you just said. One is that we must obey God rather than men, and the rosary, thankfully, has come to us from a source far beyond man, and that allows us to root ourselves. But there were three things that brought me back into the Catholic faith: the rosary, the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and the doctrine of the Assumption. And because those three things, when I reflect on it, are all things that pull us upward, and that's the essence of what we obey God rather than man. We focus our devotions in such a way that we are always allowing ourselves to be pulled upward, as Peter was pulled out of the Sea of Galilee when his faith failed and as he was walking out towards Christ. And the other thing that I love that quote by Lee. It's there's several. That's one of my favorites. But there's another one for all of the Nietzscheans and the will to power types and the romanticists that we were speaking of earlier. Goethe has a quote that's similar. It's, how does one know oneself? Never through reflection, but only through action. You begin to do your duty, and then you know what is within you. And that's the essence. It's not just a matter of being, but also of becoming, that duty represents in our lives. And I think that that's as much a Christian virtue as it is a pagan one.
Um, especially, I do want to kind of touch on something and make our audience aware of the importance of the Sacred Heart. I just recently read was it the Jesus King of Love. I think that really it's an important book to me recently, and I'm giving it to priests, I'm giving it to all my friends, and I think it's a book you guys should pick up. Our mutual friend, kind of recommended it to me. But it really is like I think it's the Rosary and the Sacred Heart is the ways forward, and I don't think that can be stressed enough. Um, yeah, that was I tell that.
Well, Our Lady said that um, Archbishop Lefebvre said that we are all children of the Revolution, and that's certainly true to a greater or lesser extent, depending on how we view ourselves. But the Sacred Heart was to be invoked against the Revolution, and the Rosary Fatima was to be used against the heirs of Russia. So I can't stress that both of these, we are all of us, even someone as saintly and as learned and grounded in solid Catholic teaching as Archbishop Lefebvre said, even I am a child of the Revolution. And I just got to echo those sentiments myself. And Mario Goretti, I know you've got to go here in just a minute, but if you could give the folks who are listening to Fundamental Principle your information one more time before you sign off, and I would love to continue this conversation some other time when we both have more time.
Which is difficult with large Catholic families. But yes, the Daily Decade is currently restricted to Telegram. I'm planning on expanding that again. I do have a website. I even have an email address, Daily Decade Requests at proton.me. That's requests in the plural. And I used to be on Anchor, what eventually became Spotify for podcasters. I'm looking for another site. But right now, you can still find me on Telegram. The Daily Decade, and you'll be able to listen there to my Telegram exclusive posts until I get the podcast up and running. In the meanwhile, if you want to write to me, you can write to me there or find me, Mario J. Goretti at Dread SCOTUS on Telegram is where you'll find me to contact me directly. Other than that, if you can't find me on Telegram, I used to be on Post. I haven't logged in a very, very long time. I forgot my password. I have to get back on there again. If it's still even around, I'm not sure. The Fediverse kind of fell off there a bit. But either of the gentlemen with whom I'm speaking now will also be able to get you in touch with me if you have questions or some contribution or anything like that. Where you want to just hear the backlog, I can give you the back episodes.
Thank you so much for being here, Mario. Would you close us in an Ave, please? And it was a pleasure and an honor speaking to you. Thank you so much for being here. I've been Jerome, and with my co-host Patrick, and this has been Mario Goretti.
Hang on a second. I'm disconnected.
I was asking you if you'd lead us in Ave as an outro, and I just want to say thank you one more time for being with us today.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to. Do you Latin or English?
Latin, of course.
Okay, in that case, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Jesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Gloria Patria, Filio et Spiritui Sancto.
Sic ut erat in principio et nunc et semper et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.